All right, AP World History, we're going to crank out section 4 here, okay? Kind of trying to move things along relatively quickly on this unit. And so, maritime empires link regions. What all are we talking about there? We're talking about these growing powers, these European powers, as they begin to increase the amount of trade they're doing and kind of the spread around the world. Kind of almost think of like like an octopus with tentacles spreading out. You're going to see the world, and you could almost talk about this as kind of like a proto-globalization. Using new sailing technologies and ships and things like that that can get around places quicker, and kind of in a small sort of way begin to shrink that world down a little bit with improved transportation methods and that kind of thing. And in doing so, able to create these linkages as you start to see the beginnings of some growing empires. Okay, so like I said, just want to work it through this system, or excuse me, through this section. Okay, so yeah, this whole idea of expanding empires is kind of what it's all about. I mean, it's going to be political, it's going to be religious, it's going to be economic. And what it's all going to revolve around, really, at the heart of it all, is this growing sense of rivalry. Okay, now these European countries, whether it's the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, the British. Did I ever say the British? Our long and growing list there. They begin to see each other as competitors now that they're out there. Whether it's establishing trading posts or proper colonies, they're now beginning to eye each other suspiciously, and not that it had always just been peas and carrots before, but there is going to be that sense of rivalry, and whether you are talking about, like I said, political rivalry, religious rivalry, and economic rivalry. Okay, so that's kind of like the kind of, I don't know, in the background of all this that's going to be going on. Let's go back to Portugal. I know we've talked about Portugal kind of making some poor choices in terms of going down that trading post empire road versus going straight into colonies. They're going to maintain that course. They will end up with one fairly significant colony, and that's going to be over here in the Americas. I think we'll come back and chat about this a little bit later on. But in 1494, a treaty will be put in place that gives Portugal some influence over just a small part of South America. Really, present day Brazil will be Portugal's only colony in the New World. And then beyond that, Portugal is pretty much going to maintain their trade post empire. And again, most of it focused on Africa, okay? West coast of Africa. Some of it will end up on the east coast as well. And they're going to continue to do business with some of the African tribes, some of the African kingdoms that are located there, and kind of making money that way. Are they making the same kind of money as the Spanish are making in the Americas? No, they are not. But on the flip side, Portugal is still also a smaller country, so this will work for Portugal for a while. The trade that they are doing, as we kind of mentioned before, is now beginning to include not just trade goods but humans. And again, the Portuguese are going to play a fairly early role here in the early days of this, as far as moving slaves out of Africa. Many of them actually ending up working sugar plantations in Brazil, taking them across with the kind of the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade. And so some of that's going to operate from their trading post empire, particularly on the west coast of Africa. And some of the kingdoms and tribes that they're working with, what they trade those slaves for are for basically for gunpowder, for weapons, that they can then turn around to use to make warfare against other tribes, other kingdoms, and then take those prisoners, haul them out to the coast, and trade them, and put them into the slave trade. So Europeans play their part in the slave trade, and obviously it's the European demand for slaves that is the main driver of the slave trade. But there is some involvement by Africans themselves enslaving some of, I won't say their own people, because again, they identified different tribal systems, different kingdoms, but, enslaving other Africans and then selling them, trading them to Europeans, with the majority of them then heading over to the Americas, where for a long time, you really going all the way into the 19th century, in a lot of different parts of the Americas, the slave population is going to outnumber the European population. All right, so you got all that going on. Also, while we're still here talking about Africa, let's talk about the rise of a couple of new kingdoms that are popping up: the Asante Empire and the Kingdom of Congo. These are both empires that are going to rise up. Some of on traditional trade, and so actual trade goods that will be powering this. But these are definitely going to be kind of the big shakers and the movers. Taking some of the spotlight away from like the Songhai Kingdom up there, for more in the sub-Saharan area, and they will participate in a little bit of the slave trade, these two empires, but most of it kind of revolves around political power and traditional forms of trade for in-demand trade goods. And some of that business they will do with Portugal directly. Okay, and like I said, Portugal will just maintain its presence in Africa. Over on the east coast of Africa, they'll actually conquer a couple of African kingdoms and not turn them into colonies, but kind of more directly control those areas to take control of the trade that was coming out of them. Okay, let's see here. Move it along. Move it along. Well, as we've alluded to before, just again, talking about this idea that not everyone is in an expansion mode. And Asia is really where we see the opposite going on. In Japan, they had been trading pretty extensively with the Portuguese. Matter of fact, even letting Portuguese missionaries bring Christianity to Japan. And, while we didn't have massive numbers, there were Japanese people that were converting to Christianity. You also had some Dutch traders that were doing some business in Japan, but Japanese leaders do an about face. They fear that more of this European interference, the role of the Christianity being introduced now to Japan, could threaten the unity that they have created. And so, in a rather kind of abrupt move, the Japanese tell both the Portuguese and the Dutch to get out. And pretty much slam the door on the outside world, and they're going to maintain that positioning. This happens in the 1600s. They're going to hold that position until the United States shows up in the 1850s and kind of drags them back into the modern world. But for Japan, it's going to be a pretty, absolute, cutting off of the outside world. China, not as extreme. We've already talked about, that with the Ming Dynasty, they already start the kind of process of retreating. They're the dynasty that calls back Zheng He's expedition, start rebuilding the Great Wall. It's pretty clear, they've got a different attitude. And even when the Qing comes in, the Manchus take over. They're not going to be in an expansive mood. They're in more of a protective mood. And so they will allow very limited trade here and there with some countries, and they'll only allow certain ports to be used for trade. They don't allow any private businesses to come in from Europe or anywhere else to conduct trade. It's like, if you're coming, directly as representative of your country, we'll do some business with you. But they too are a little bit fearful of what those outside influences could end up resulting in if it goes unchecked. Okay, all of this expansion is definitely going to increase the need for more workers, as we're seeing the growth of more trading posts, as we're seeing the growth of bigger and bigger colonies, and the realization of what crops could be turned into big money makers. The influence of the Columbian exchange now getting thrown into the mix of all that. And so you're going to need more people working. Okay, and that supply of labor is going to come in two main ways that we'll hit here. The first one, indentured servitude. Okay, some of you who had some American history back in middle school remember your early colonial days. Might remember being taught about indentured servitude because it was used pretty extensively in the 13 colonies, but it's also used in some of the other colonies. And indentured servitude, a lot of times, involved the use of poorer Europeans who maybe were looking for opportunity. Some of them were people who were in debtor's prison who couldn't pay their bills and were offered indentured servitude as an option to sitting and waiting to catch some kind of illness in an English or a French prison and and end up dying in there. This was a way to maybe start over the new life. And the indenture, kind of like you see the picture there on the right side, is basically kind of like a little contract, usually between the person who will be that servant and the person who is sponsoring, or the company that is sponsoring them. So in effect, what this means is someone is going to pay to get you over to the Americas, and that's where most of this is being used, vast majority of it being used. They'll get you over to the Americas. They'll get you set up, maybe like on a plantation, on a farm, or whatever kind of job or work you may be doing. You'll be taken care of in terms of, food and housing and, the basic needs you need. But in return for that, you're going to work for someone. It's going to be almost kind of like a slightly glorified version of slavery. You're going to work for someone, and it's going to really boil down to what that contract was. Most of them usually lasted somewhere between 5 to 7 years, was pretty average for this indenture to take place. And then after that, usually part of the contract was that at the conclusion of your contract, when that 5-7 years came along, you usually would be given an award of a little bit of cash that you could take with you. And you could kind of consider that your money to kind of get yourself started. And at that point, you're a free person. And the land was cheap in the New World. The vast majority of these indentured servants, once they gained their freedom, they stayed here and kind of bought their own land and started their own lives. Okay, and so that was one that both sides benefit on that. Someone gets cheap labor that they have for 5 to 7 years, and then on the flip side of that, someone who maybe didn't have a lot of prospects back in Europe can kind of recreate a new life with new opportunities over here in the Americas. All right, that's indentured servitude. The other one we've already kind of mentioned before, and that is chattel slavery. And that term chattel is kind of a reference to the term property. Okay, indentured servants were never considered to be the legal property of the person who had sponsored them and was paying their way. That indentured servant still had some rights that existed. Chattel slavery, absolutely not. Those slaves, and this is usually we're going to connect to slaves coming from Africa. And so you can see there is kind of a race difference here. Although you will find examples in the early days, there were some blacks who came over to the Americas as indentured servants. It's just that over time, the system morphed more and more and more into chattel slavery. And slaves in that system are considered to be legal property of the slaveholder, okay? Just as much as property like land or a wagon or horses or anything else is theirs, is their property. Those slaves are their property. And so as their property, they can do to them as they see fit. There's usually an investment. They're having to pay for these slaves, and the common logic is that you'll take good care of them because they are an investment. And if you're cruel and you have slaves dying off left and right, then that puts you in the spot as the slave owner, running a plantation, that you are going to have to expend more of your profits to buy more labor. And so saying that. Slavery was, clearly a nightmarish experience for the vast majority of people who were involved in it. Okay, but that'll be the other way that we'll see some of those labor needs being met. Those are the two big ones you want to know about. Okay. And really, by the time we get to the early 18th century, 1700s, slavery by that point in time, whether we're talking about North America, South America, Central America, is very much going to be race-based, right? And that's where you're seeing those literally millions of Africans being brought across the Atlantic and entered into chattel slavery. All right, section D here. Getting back to this concept of rivalries that we were talking about, we are going to see rivalry popping up in various parts of the world. Okay, India. Let's talk about India. We're going to have all kinds. So we already talked about the Portuguese setting up some of their trading posts there. The British are going to elbow their way in. We kind of hinted about this back in Unit 3 when we talked about the slow kind of the fall of the Mughal Empire and interference by the British and the French. The Portuguese are going to play a little bit of a role in that as well. And these three countries will see themselves as rivals in terms of who's going to dominate trade in India. Again, lots of high demand trade goods coming from India, whether it is cotton or salt or some of the spices that kind of make their way from Southeast Asia up into India and kind of go on from there. Those kinds of things. And so you are going to see them. Part of that story, and we'll come back to this later on, is the rise of a joint stock company called the British East India Company. They are going to end up, they're going to be basically a private business that is chartered by the British government to be able to trade in various parts of the world. And East India, you can kind of tell by the name where their main focus is going to be. It's going to be the Indian Ocean region. And they're going to exercise a lot of influence time going on here in India. Matter of fact, as they start to set up operations and doing trade in India to keep their businesses secure, to keep their trade secure, they even basically raise their own private army. They pay Indians, guys. They call them sepoys, and these end up being kind of like these private soldiers, this private army to make sure that the British East India Company can do business the way that it wants to do. Okay, and that will kind of turn up the heat on the competition going on in India and give the British a little bit more of an edge over the Portuguese and the French. All right. Let's see. Meanwhile, back in the Americas, rivalry really begins to heat up over especially North America. Okay, you have the Spanish who are still laying claim to lands down kind of Florida, a little bit into present-day Georgia. You have New France colony up there, and again more like present-day Canada, and then you have the British with their colonies along the eastern seaboard, and all of them have visions of a larger empire, of claiming more land in North America. And so, they're pushing on each other to create more and more of this kind of rivalry that's going on. They both are working to gain more and more native allies, especially the British and the French. I shouldn't really mention the Spanish in that. For the British, they create alliances with the Great Iroquois Nation that is kind of in the New York area. The French are going to have a bunch of their allies as well. That it'll all boil over in 1756, and a war will break out in North America between the British and the French. Some of you, again, if you had that middle school history, you might remember learning about the French and Indian War. And the British gave it that name because that's who they were fighting against, the French and their Indian allies. The war was also known as the 7 Years' War because it went until 1763. Some historians claim, or at least suggest, that this is actually almost can be considered the First World War because not only were the British and the French fighting in the Americas, but then they also started fighting in India to see, it's like, all right, we're going to find out who's going to be, the top of the heap here. And so there's some of that fighting that will take place in South Asia. There will also be fighting between the British and the French out in the Pacific. So fighting going on against these two old rivals all over in various locations around the world. The French and Indian War will be settled, like I said, in 1763. Basically, a defeat for the for the French. Get that down, okay? Defeat for the French. They maintain a very small presence in North America, but their big dreams of a massive New France colony are going to be pretty well shattered as a result of that. Okay, and the British, their claims in North America will be basically just made all the more a little more permanent, and definitely gaining some territory out of that as well, and puts the British kind of in the driver's seat in terms of beginning to grow what's going to end up being a massive global empire. All right. The other one I'll mention in here is I mentioned before this treaty that the Portuguese and the Spanish had signed while we're talking about America. It's called the Treaty of Tordesillas, and was signed in 1494. And again, that treaty kind of creates a line right down that kind of divides South America, and gives Portugal just kind of the tip. They're jutting out into the Atlantic Ocean that makes up modern day Brazil, and so that will be Portugal's big contribution. There we go. There's our footprint in the Americas. But they do establish it as a proper colony. So no trade post in Brazil. It'll be a colony for Portugal. All right. So we have all of that going on. And then we'll flip it over here, and as we look at this again, our little section here that is focused on all this, we can look at some examples of some continuity and change. Right, some good old CNC when we look at this expansion that's going on. And so some continuities, as these empires are expanding, some things remain the same. When it comes to the importance of trade to power their economies, that is critical. And then keeping taxes going, right? Again, a lot of the motivation for governments to be involved in this trade is they can charge taxes on the imports, the exports, and then they've got money they can use to continue to fund even more expansion. All right, so we can call that a continuity. A change is going to be this rise in military power now coming out of Europe. I'm talking a little bit about it on Guns, Germs, and Steel. Here's where we see the big changeover. Europeans are taking some of those gunpowder technologies that come out of the original empires, and they're improving on them. And so, this is where we see this is the changeover. This is where we see Europe starting to zoom up to be the dominant continent and beginning to establish these colonies all over the world. So whether we're talking about Portugal and exercising their power over the Indian Ocean region, okay, and Africa. We could throw Africa in the mix there as well. Whether we're talking about Spain and their colonies that they have created in the Americas, and creating these labor systems, okay, the encomienda and the hacienda systems, they are two basically systems they use for producing these large farms that are then operated by Native American people, and then when all the Native American people begin dying off because of smallpox and measles, that's when they then start, really amping up the transatlantic slave trade coming out of Africa. And so, yes, the use of those labor systems to keep all that going on, and they are forced labor systems. Okay, these people are not given a choice; they operate as slaves. And then the haciendas were just kind of a Spanish name for the large plantations that they operate. All right. Let's see. What else do we got here? Silver and mercantilism. Hold on just a sec here. All right. I had a dog that needed to use the restroom. Well, actually, go outside. All right. So for C, silver and mercantilism. So, by the time we go a little bit further, into the 17th and into the 18th century, most of all the gold in the Americas is gone. Okay, but there is still a lot of silver. and the Spanish will really kind of double down on silver mining. Now, of course, silver mining, it is a labor-intensive effort do all the digging and all the the separating that's required. Very labor-intensive, hands-on. Of course, the Spanish are not going to do it. They again are going to make use of encomienda system with that as well. Not only is it going to be agricultural work, but now it's going to be miners. And you'll have both indigenous people and eventually African slaves as well now being put into forced labor situations in the silver industry. Okay, but that will again, when they start to worry, the gold's gone, this is it. But no, the silver will kind of save the day and prop up their economies that way. Okay. Mercantilism has a connection to silver. Mercantilism is an economic philosophy where a government involves itself very heavily in trade. Okay, they regulate trade. The government will set rules that businesses have to abide by. This is where you get government stepping in and charging really high tariffs, which are taxes, okay, basically on imports that are coming into your country, and using trade to make profits for the government itself. That is what mercantilism is, right? When you have a government that's just pretty much kind of like, we are going to be very hands-on, and we're going to set all these rules, and you're going to play this by the way we call it. That's what we're talking about with mercantilism, okay? And you see governments increasingly doing this, as they're making a lot of money off of these colonies. The governments see it as for what it is. Like, this is an opportunity, to make our countries more powerful, and then in turn they can expand even further, right? So it's kind of like, you're getting on that wheel and you can't get off, because it's kind of like, you make the money. The more money you make, the bigger your empire can get. The bigger your empire you get, the more money you make. There you go. All right. Okay, labor systems, some more continuity and change. Continuities, again, the African slave trade. It's going to be huge. It's going to continue to play a role until it is outlawed in the early 1800s. And then still will continue on in the brand new United States until little Civil War breaks out in the 1860s. But there's no getting around. It's we talked about it going all the way back to the Arab world and in the Indian Ocean and trade. That there was slavery already operating out of the African continent. So that is a massive continuity. The millions of slaves who are being transported to the Americas. Okay, the big change is just that now, instead of the slaves for the most part heading in a more eastern direction, now you have them heading west to the Americas, across the Atlantic Ocean, and in numbers that dwarfs what was being used in the Indian Ocean trade, numbers that were going, ending up in the Arab world. Like I said, millions upon millions of Africans being transported across the Atlantic to North America, to Central America, and especially South America. I think us Americans, especially, we get it in our minds that that we probably made the biggest use of African slavery here in the colonies in the United States. No, we had a lot, but nothing close to what was going on down in South America, parts of Central America, and the Caribbean. That's where you're going to find the bulk of African slavery being used. Okay, so there is that. Again, if we're talking about sticking on this idea of changes, what we talked about before, chattel slavery, we could talk about throw in indentured servitude as well. But as the Americas are now being more and more exploited, they need workers. And then, Columbia Exchange, and again, that smallpox and the measles. We've got labor shortages. And that's where we're going to be looking more and more back to Africa for answering those labor shortage issues, and through the slave trade. Okay, and then let's see here. I know we're getting down here. I always try to keep these things around 30 minutes. So let's just kind of do it this way. We're going to go into just a little more deep dive here on this slide, and that'll get us pretty darn close to where we need to be. All right, transporting the slaves. That was done through these these kind of, I wouldn't say they're newly designed ships. They are cargo ships that are then converted for transporting the slaves. The slaves are stuffed down into these what we call holds, and in the decks of these ships that were made for boxes, for crates, for cargo. They're not made for humans. Matter of fact, most of them, a human can't even stand up completely straight. And so these slaves, oftentimes, they make the transport across the Atlantic, either in a sitting position, a crouched down position, or lying down position. They are cramped in there. They already figure that a lot of them will die along the way, what they call the middle passage, which is the trip when we think about the triangular trade that eventually ends up going on from Africa to the Americas, from the Americas to Europe, and then from Europe back down to Africa. And basically, what it is slaves coming from Africa to the Americas, the agricultural output, the mineral output, then being transported from ship from the Americas over to Europe, and then from Europe they load up with trade goods to go back down to Africa to trade to get even more slaves and start the process over again. They considered upwards of a 50% death rate on these ships to be acceptable, what they called spoilage. Okay, if 50% of the slaves on that ship died on the trip over, they still saw it as a profitable trip. Okay, a completely inhumane system that they're operating here, and and viewing these Africans basically as not being truly humans at the same level. And this is where we're starting to see some of that, this kind of cultural. This is going beyond just mere racism, because they don't view the Africans in many cases to be humans the same way that they view Europeans as being human, and believe that they have just this God-given right to subject them to this sort of thing. And so that is terrible enough. And then there's the demographic change that goes on back back in Africa. What happens here in the Americas itself? You have massive depopulation in different parts of Africa. You have massive family disruption. The breaking up of different class distinctions. All this kind of thing is going on, and all of it, as part of this of the spread and expansion of the slavery system. Most of it going to the Americas, some of it still existing there in the Indian Ocean region, and so you have that. And I guess I'm getting ahead of myself there. I don't want you to fixate on thinking that all the slavery is just all going to the Americas. It does still exist, and there is still somewhat. It is, like I mentioned before, it is dwarfed by what is going on in the Americas. But there is still a slave trade that is going on at a smaller scale in the Indian Ocean region. Most of the slave trade, I guess if I'm going to make one distinction between that Indian Ocean slave trade, besides the size, is over time, there's not as much chattel slavery going on in the Indian Ocean region. Most of the slaves coming from Africa are going somewhere in more of like an indentured servitude kind of a system. And so, they will eventually, most of them will have that opportunity to eventually be free and either stay where they're at, or if they can figure out how to get back to Africa, see what's left of their families, that sort of thing, they can do that. Okay, so we can look at it that way. It's also a little bit of change and a difference between slavery going on to the Americas versus this. All right, there we go. That gets us where we need to be and leaves me about 3 minutes over where I want it to be. We'll pick up in section 5 of the unit when we get back together. All right, we'll head into maintaining. What does it take to maintain a maritime empire? And we'll get you some more economics and stuff with that. Okay, you got it. I'll see you later. Take care.